Yeah, so it was interesting talking about this sexuality and myth, and we try to introduce the concept of sex and importance even in spiritual practice. But let's talk about what does it all mean in my personal life. Like, forget about culture, forget about spirituality, forget about religion. What the sex is doing to my life in my spiritual practice. Let's focus on that. So before I ask your opinion, let me share my few idea about this castration, because why I was interested, because I was interested for many reasons, but I did not mention in our previous discussion what was my personal motivation. So as a Muslim, as a book of the law, like even in Jewish people, every male person has to do circumcision. And circumcision is a genital mutilation. If you think about medical terminology, it's a genital mutilation. So it's a serious, major, irreversible undertaking for your entire life. And it's a surgical procedure. But thousands and millions of people across culture is doing it without questioning that why I have to do it. It's just a blind symbol, or it has some real significance. So that was my main motivation, because I read in last 10, 20, 15 years, because that was always my question. Why? What's the meaning of circumcision? People, if you ask the religious leader, like Muslim mullah, they will say, oh, it's a divine commandment. You have to do it. If you ask some other people who are spiritually inclined, but they are not particularly scientifically inclined, they will say, oh, it's for cleanliness. Other people say, oh, circumcision is beneficial for health. It prevents some cancer. This is all bullshit, in my personal opinion, because
I agree with you entirely.
because in the time of Egyptian pharaoh, they're not aware of this health benefit. They're not aware of this papilloma virus. They're not awareness of cancer, right? And similarly, before the time of Abraham, people did circumcision. So it did not start with Abraham. So
Mhm.
it's not because Abraham had a commandment, that's why we're doing it. It's before that. So the three reasons I mentioned, it doesn't go with your personal belief, because if you dig deeper, nothing stays valid. So then I went to see who had circumcision or castration before this religious stuff. It has to be myth. So now the first person who got castrated was Osiris, right?
Mhm.
So now, if you study Osiris versus Kronos, I can see like penis or phallus was a symbol of creativity. Like it's a progeny, like one person after another, and it's a directionless, continuous creativity. It's like infinite creativity. Like phallic symbol is like symbol of procreation and regeneration. That's the grand scheme of thing. And because God is the creator, his tool is creativity. And if you want to find a symbol, what is the symbol of creativity? Is the phallus.
Mhm.
So now why it has to be cut down? That's the mystery. Because if you say God is the symbol, God has the creativity, and we're using phallus as a symbol of creativity, then why the castration? That doesn't make any sense. Now, in my understanding, in old time, as Plato said, all these Greek myth like Zeus, Kronos, they're all glorified human. They're very ancient human, but people use those human as gods to tell you a story. That was Plato's understanding. Because even like Plato has two schools, exoteric school and esoteric school. You know that, right? This Neoplatonism came from esoteric part,
Mhm.
and the exoteric part everybody knows. So in his personal belief, he obviously understood, even though I'm talking about all kinds of God, but in his personal belief, those are human. So now, if I can connect this human with divine together, then I can, as a spiritual believer, like if I consider myself, just hypothetically, that if I'm trying to justify this entire scenario, this goes like this: that because God has been creating and creating and creating non-stop, like vegetation grows, then dies, new generation comes, new species comes, divergence comes, different people color, different personality comes. It never stops. So what's the end goal of all this creativity? If you ask that question, is there any end or there's no end? Traditional religious people in all tradition told human is the end of all creation. In every culture, monotheistic religion says man is the best creation. In Egypt, Osiris, human are the crown jewel of all creativity. So if you believe that human are the final destination of this creativity, symbolically, it stops. So in my understanding, that because with the appearance of human, the creativity has stops. So that symbolizes the castration. That means human, just suppose I am the human in the name of Kronos. I realize that I cut down the creative god Uranus, and that he cannot create any more species because I, human, is the end of all creation. For example, even though I go to Alpha Century, if I find a sentient being, they have to understand the duality, good and bad, right? They have to understand self versus non-self. As a human, I can still understand that part, right? So I'm at the par with them. So even though they might not look like me, but I'm at the par, at the terminal of all creation. You understand what I'm saying? It's not a human itself, but our intellect that understands good and bad, up and down, is duality, right? So now, if you consider yourself as the end of all creation, then this castration signifies the sealing the deal. You know, there's English term, I seal the deal. So by castration, the creativity stops with human. So human becomes the dead end host of the divine by the symbol of castration. And because in the tradition, God has cut down the creativity with the creation of human, but if I myself cut down my phallus, then I cannot create. But as a biological person, I still have to continue my duty. So how can I do it? By symbolically doing a circumcision. So that's my understanding of all this myth in my personal life.
That's very interesting. I'm glad you explained it more than I got. You made a reference to that, to your ideas in your email.
Yeah.
And I didn't really understand it, so I'm glad that you took some time to elaborate it in that way. That's very, very interesting idea.
So now, regarding, so if for example, in Kronos, what he did in Centurion, there's an old Chaldean historian that Biblos of Greek recorded partially. So he documented that Kronos, after castrating his father, felt bad, and he saw his sons are roaming around, and he saw no longer need for any more creation of generation, because there is every 3 generation of gods. In Greek, like first there's Uranus, second is Kronos, and the third is Zeus, right? So after Zeus came, there's no need for any more creation because he's already complete. If Zeus is a man, suppose, glorified man.
Right.
So if Zeus is already complete and does the job of the father, if Zeus is doing the job of the father, if Zeus fulfills the obligation of father's task, then there's no need for any more creation. So what's the purpose of Uranus's phallus? Nothing. Cut it down. That was the Kronos' justification. But now, because he incapacitated a divine being, and he himself understands that actually creativity has to continue, because spiritually you can cut down the procreation, but biologically you still have to continue. So it has a purpose. So then you feel the repentance. As a repentance, you have to do something, but you cannot cut down your own phallus because it has function. So what you do, you symbolically reenact the ritual of circumcision. So this might be prehistorical, before even Osiris, this ancient tradition of this circumcision. It boils down, man is the crown jewel of creation, symbol of this phallus cutting and everything. So now, okay, so, but what's the relation with sex with divine? Because that's another interesting thing. I think you can be more explicitly, like, you can explain it better as a person. For example, what's your understanding of sex as a samadhi? Like you mentioned samadhi. Samadhi is a nirvana. It's a big term, right? It's a mukti. It's a nirvana. It's a liberation. It's the ultimate final human experience. So now you tell me how you can achieve nirvana or samadhi through sex symbolically.
I just think it's possible. I think there are, I know you said you have a medical background. I think that in a materialistic model, if we're just working with the brain, I think there are a finite number of destinations. There may be many ways to get there, but sex can produce a state like this. Certain psychedelics can produce a state like this. Meditation can produce a state like this. Other behaviors, but there is a particular kind of state, samadhi, satori, that humans are capable of, and they may get there different ways. I don't care if you get there by sex or if you get there some other way. The sexual experiences tend to be temporary. They're not long lasting, but that's true with early days in meditation too. You can just taste it, but then it takes a lot more practice to get stabilized in that state. And in that state, there is no separation, as you know, self and other, it's all one. And I think, as you said yourself earlier, in sex, even if it's just at the level of an orgasm, with a great orgasm, that union, that drive of sex to completely unite with another person, to transcend your self limits, even if it's only for a moment of pure connection with some other person. I see that as very similar to this sense of losing your personal boundaries to transcend everything in non-duality.
Exactly. In the mythological term, if I translate whatever you just said in the Osiris or this Kronos mythological term, like the problem of death. That's why Osiris has to die. God has to die. Somehow God has to die. I'll tell you the three parallel. Osiris has to die. Jesus, before he was preaching, everybody is saying he has to die. Paul was saying that unless he dies, then how come we get liberated? Because he was more interested, he has to die. And similarly, as you know, in Old Testament, on seventh day, he rested. What does you mean by rested? Means he retired, he dies. Even the death concept of God is everywhere. All tradition. Now, why God has to die? Because of materiality. Because the moment you have material, it has decay. But God is also eternal too. So you are simultaneously eternal, but if you want to know yourself by yourself, you have to create material. Now, the moment you create material, the temporality comes, because as you know, time is the measure between objects. The matter, whatever matter is doing is the time. Time is not a separate thing. So Chronos is the time, right? And Chronos is that's why he's the ruler. He's the top ruler. Even Saturn is the top ruler of all this astrology. Saturn is the time, the planet Saturn I'm talking about. After Jupiter, Saturn was the last planet that you can see by the visible eye. That Neptune, Uranus you cannot see. In ancient tradition, Saturn was the highest of all gods because he didn't move. He moves in 33 years.
Right.
So among all gods, he's the most steady. Because he's most steady, he's the measure of time. Because if you move yourself, you cannot measure time. You have to be steady to observe what other people are doing, then you can measure the time. The bottom line is Chronos, Saturn is time. Everybody knows that. My understanding is because Chronos is time and time becomes a necessity because material. And the moment time comes, you have to die too. So that's why God has to die. Now, how you can overcome the death is the mystery, Christian mystery also, right? The resurrection, death and resurrection is the ultimate mystery of Christianity. The Osiris, death and resurrection was the ultimate mystery religion in ancient time, right? The sex is the secret recipe of overcoming death. Because suppose you are the God the Father, suppose now you want to make yourself known to yourself and to other. In your calculation, the only way is to create material, but by creating material, the byproduct is death. The death is introduced because you want to create material. And why you want to create material? Because you want to make yourself known to self and to others. And now the ultimate goal of God is obstructed by the death. Because you want to create you just want a simple thing that to make yourself known, and on your way you have to create material, but the problem is death. The moment you create material, death will come. Now, if material themselves then combine and overcome death, you also prevented the ultimate barrier. See, from God's perspective, death is the ultimate overcoming of the thing you wanted, but you have to overcome it. So that ties, that's why sex, death, castration, phallus, all things are actually interconnected in mind as just a mythology reader. Because the reason I read mythology to understand this mystery of death and resurrection, because in order to understand the death and resurrection, you have to go to mythology, because I don't think Bible will explicitly teach you this, whatever I'll just say, because I got this from mythology, right? So in my mind, that's why sex is so important, because sex is the ultimate tool where you will get the chance of overcoming death, and you can continue in perpetuity even in the material world. And the other thing about the sex is, suppose you know qualia, right? The personal perception of pleasure. It's a very problematic term, because who is the perceiver? People say I am the perceiver, but actually it might be false ego. God is the perceiver, real perceiver of pain and pleasure. Now you just calculate which one God likes the most, the sex. That mystery is also solved, because God really wants this thing to happen. That's why he put pleasure on this particular sex the most, because that's most valuable. The food is necessary, sleep is necessary, but in God's calculation, because he has to come to the material world to make himself known, but the greatest barrier is the death, and the greatest barrier is overcome by the sex, so that will be most precious in his mind. So in divine mind, sex is most precious because it overcomes mortality, That's why Freudian psychology talks about death and sex together. Actually, the link comes from this way. Because of the materiality, death becomes a necessity, and only sex can overcome this barrier of death. Because ultimately, if you know uh, Joseph Campbell's journey, hero's journey,
Yeah.
everybody's journey's ultimate target is overcoming death.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody wants immortality, whether they know it or not. And why everybody wants immortality? Because I think it's God instinct. Because God knows He's immortal, and that instinct is also in human being. And we deep inside know we are immortal, but we don't know why, how. So everybody is still looking for immortality. And that in the physical world, if you talk about immortality, the sex is the ultimate focal point of that immortality. You are actually producing immortality by your future generation.
Mm-hmm.
So that should be most pleasurable from God's point of view. And that's why if you talk about this, who is the perceiver of pleasure, actually we human are the mirror image, or the image of God, right? So in our world, we're labeling it as orgasm, but in divine world, purpose is served. That's why it's more pleasurable. So, so I think the sex actually, when people realize by doing sex, actually I reached God.
Mm-hmm.
That really triggers a whole series of like perception, samadhi, or union with God, or moksha, because I don't know if they can see the entire story or not, but at least they feels the importance of sex with the God, God's union. Because if you see 100% transparently all the steps, your samadhi experience becomes more powerful.
Mm-hmm.
But if even though you don't see all the connection, it's still powerful, because that's the most important experience a God can have, and mere human being are mirroring the pleasure of the God himself, something like that. So that was my hidden motivation to talk with you, because you touched the very topics of sex as a symbol of liberation. Not many people talks about it. Probably I'll just heavily redact, because not many people will understand, and people will misunderstand 90% of it. But I will try to still put some of the second part as a follow-up with you.
Yeah, I think you should. I think those are important ideas to get out. And
Yes.
as I said, yeah, I didn't really appreciate all the sophistication of your thinking until you laid it out for me here. So I think it would be something you should consider interviewing yourself.
When I read Freudian psychology, when I read your work, I see like you're trying to communicate this thing to me. I felt you are trying to communicate the union with divine through sex. But many people will not see that connection. But I felt the connection, that you are trying to tell me the same story that I'm concocting in my mind. You see my point? That I was concocting a story. You pointed, oh, I'm telling the same story. Why not? So that's why I really felt that I need to talk with you, because I would say, like, lots of people instantly dismiss whatever I just said in the last 10 minutes.
Mhm.
They will instantly dismiss that this is just bullshit.
Yeah.
But unless you see yourself the connection, you will not appreciate what I was talking. So because I was pretty sure that you will appreciate what I'm thinking, I felt the need to talk with you.
Well, good. I'm glad you did.
Yeah.
I'm glad
Yeah,
you did.
exactly. Thank you for your time, and I think we'll meet again sometimes.
Thank you. I hope so. Thank you very much.
Have a good night.
You too.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.